Hello and welcome to a lecture about Paul Feyerabend. Between physics and philosophy, I will speak about the Austrian philosopher of science, Feyerabend. He was born in 1924 and he died a bit early, only at the age of 70, and he's definitely one of those philosophers that leaves a remark or mark in your consciousness. Is very different, and his starting point, if you want to compare him to Popper or Kuhn, is that he's deeply involved in physics himself. As a physicist, he started out and he always kept his connections to physics. I will show something that he goes against. In his most famous book, Against Method, he goes against the idea that scientific progress is logical, and it makes any sense. He also refutes that it comes from sense, so that there is a logical progression of things that leads up to a scientific discovery. Actually, he is even denying the Kuhnian idea of a great emergence of findings leading to a paradigmatic shift. So he went against Kuhn, and that's double odd because Kuhn was a teacher of Feyerabend, was one of Feyerabend's teachers. So that idea is that there is a accumulation of knowledge. Everybody's doing science, and that progresses science. Feyerabend would say not necessarily so. And today I will focus on quantum physics. And in quantum physics, it doesn't really follow this model. There's no accumulation of understanding leads up to the actual discovery. Maybe a little bit more of the opposite, a lack of understanding that forces humanity into a new path completely. But creativity is most definitely an important part, which leads to the four other refusal, that science is resolutions of problems in reality. So how to solve that problem, thereby naturally we have a scientific explanation or a scientific problem solving resolutions. A third thing that's even more frightening in the beginning when you start reading Feyerabend is that he goes against rationality. I think here is what you can see even more of a parallel between Paul Feyerabend and quantum mechanics. What does quantum mechanics refute? Well, in some ways it does actually refute rationality. A thing can be both true and wrong at the same time. Remember, Schrödinger's cat is both alive and dead at the very same time. And now, in this third aspect, Feyerabend is really going against the grain of Western rationality. The very pillars of the temple of rationality. Smock in the head on Auguste Comte, and of course on the Vienna Circle, which I think it makes it even more interesting because Feyerabend himself was Austrian, particularly Vienna, if I'm not misremember here. So rationality got its greatest form in Vienna, and is also where it gets most harshly refuted by Paul Feyerabend. Paul Feyerabend means that there is no actual way of doing scientific progress. So he's even refuting the idea of that there being something as science with a big S. The science. This actually, the understanding of Feyerabend can be very helpful in understanding how do we approach quantum mechanics. And one point that Feyerabend does is that even the Newtonian science is not rational. And why is that? Well, the different strands of classical physics actually are not possible to put in each other. They are excluded from each other, mutually opposite. One such example is the parallel between hydrodynamics and thermodynamics. They are both incommensurable. You can't put one into the other. So already in Newtonian physics, you don't have like science with a big S. Either you have thermodynamics and then hydrodynamics is not true or doesn't work. But if you have hydrodynamics, on the other hand, thermodynamics doesn't work. Isn't that amazing? This is actually what made me as an engineer interested in the beginning, because I had this idea that there was just one science and one measuring rod, 1 meter for science, where all scientific discovery could be measured. So you have like almost a sort of diagram here where you could say this discovery is worth this much and this one is worth this much, and compared to this smaller one here. No, there's no way. So that idea is actually wrong, and this is not peculiar to Feyerabend. We know it's to be wrong. Everybody knows it. Isn't that a surprise? There's no such thing as science with a big S. It is a way of being. It's more like being maybe a golfer. So you make some progress. But no golfer would say, oh, there are some fundamental rules in making a putt. However you make a putt, I have no idea, but there is no foundational putt. And as you can hear here, he goes against an interesting part of rationality, which is Platonism. The idea that there is an absolute truth. There are actually truth values out there somewhere in the universe. We just need to reach out for them, and they can be termed consequently and consistently either true or false. That does not hold, at least according to Feyerabend. And this is also how it started with Feyerabend. You can understand his intellectual development. Himself tried one of those things out and it didn't work. And that was his own failure with making a dissertation in classical electrodynamics. Once more, you have a field of Newtonian physics that does not sort of commiserate with other fields. It's incommensurable once more. There is no limit to the incommensurability in physics. Now it's getting even worse. Sense. there is no sense to scientific discovery. It means that initially, most probably, it cannot even make any sense. And I think that's a good point, because if it doesn't make any sense, how would you reach to the discovery through rationality if it doesn't even make any sense? Take, for instance, the idea that the whole universe acquires the properties that you give it through your measurement method. So if you choose to measure the universe as a wave, the universe will become a wave, but that will exclude particles. There's no chance of particles if you decide you yourself on a wave. So the observer is actually in on it. Isn't that amazing? And of course, that does not make sense in this Cartesian Newtonian sense, like that there's no need of a measurer, there's no need of a person who does the measuring, because truth can be out there, seen only by the panopticon, or the all-seeing eye of Sauron, I often reply to. A big consciousness that has all the truths and falsehood in the world stored within somehow. No, that does not work. The last aspect that I will mention here is understanding. What does it mean to understand something? I'd say Popper and to some extent Thomas Kuhn, they would say, well, anybody can understand a scientific breakthrough, you can publish it, you can lower it down to easier text, and they could make some understanding to a greater majority. Here Feyerabend says no. He means that scientific development is an act of doing something. And it doesn't mean that you can always describe what you are doing. In this case, he is often referring to CERN, the greatest machine in the world, the biggest one, situated in Switzerland. Feyerabend had a lot of communication with CERN. He was often there, and he met physicists, workers, skilled workers, and there are a couple of thousand in CERN. And I think at the top there were 5,000. All these people do not know what they are doing. And I assume that Feyerabend would say maybe no one knows what they're doing. Together as a collective, there is an understanding from the machinery, but the single particular person doesn't know what he's doing. And that's because of two reasons. Because the mass is so great of people doing things. That's one thing. But more importantly, in Feyerabend's case, is that it is the skill that produces science. Science is skill. All these 3 or 4 or 5,000 people working in CERN are necessary for the development of a new quark or a new elementary particle like the Higgs boson. It is produced there. It doesn't have a separable reality somewhere else in the ideal world of Plato or something like that. It is produced, it's made by hand. And it's impossible to explain what you do with your hand. You do it. In the end, a paper needs to be produced, like the paper that was to the ground to this lecture. But there is no firm connection between the theory, the paper, what comes out to media, to television, radio, internet today, which is so great, and the actual development. So, actually, Feyerabend takes a much closer to art, I would say. So the scientist is more like an artist. He has skills, he or she has skills, he or she uses them in their work and produce something for the future of good use, of interesting use or understanding. It can produce understanding to a certain degree, which is not by the hand. But that's not the most important part. It's the actual skill. And I really like an example comes from The Conquest of Abundance, a book that I favor among his books. This is about the British astronomer Halley. And Halley had a telescope. And you have to understand, at that time, a couple of centuries ago, the telescope wasn't that great. So nobody could see what Halley saw through the telescope. His astronomer friends could not see it. His wife couldn't. He was so skilled in handling this very coarse instrument that he managed to see it with a trained eye, because you can train the eye so no one else can see it. Actually, it has a good support these days for neurology, because being able to see, to distinguish things, is something we train our whole life, because seeing is relational, just like painting and color. And seeing relations cannot be reduced to anything smaller, something elementary, something rational, something that could be fragmented and said, this is a certain color, this is a certain shape, this is a certain whatever. There is no foundational reality which we stand on. And that is so close to quantum mechanics. It's crazy. So it wouldn't be unfair to say that apart from his own despair in handling classical physics, Feyerabend is deeply inspired by quantum mechanics. He was working together with physicists in the quantum mechanical field his whole life, and he took a lot of inspiration from there. And he was also a skilled person, so he knew what he was talking about. And this is a side that is very interesting when you read Conquest and Abundance. He takes example from architecture, art, the aesthetic history, language, the development of language, and how we could come up to this thinking mistake, sort of, this misunderstanding of reality. That reality could be consistently and coherently reduced to a single thing, a single spot, an atom, or a single location, or a single instance of time. Feyerabend can help you to see that. He's actually, as I would say, he is a segue into quantum mechanics. It loosens up these ties that are so strong today, and they lead to passivity, leads to less creativity. You start thinking the world is already created, well, in a way it is, but it's finished. There's nothing else to do. Let me end here with a phrase I really like, and that is when Max Planck, maybe the most important in the beginning of quantum mechanics, most important physicist in the beginning of quantum mechanics, he went up to his master, his teacher, started discussing, what should I do in my future, Planck said, Max Planck. And his teacher said, no, don't go into physics, because that's a finished subject. We know everything now, more or less. There's very little left to do. And this was in the early 20th century. Can you imagine? People thought the whole world was done by the 20th century. And there he struggles on, he doesn't give up physics, and then we discover that physics is much bigger. Maybe 1 billion times much bigger than the knowledge we had. And it is completely different. This is something that Kuhn could never predict with his paradigmatic shifts, because quantum mechanics opens up so much more. Nothing is similar in the extent of what reality is. Now, no one would say that physics is finished, and that's never going to happen. Something that Feyerabend is in union with. Okay, I say thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Bye.